The boy's boots cracked through the thin ice with every frantic step. He didn't cry, not yet. He was past that. His breath burned his lungs. The bundle he carried was heavier than it had been hours ago. His mother's wool cloak soaked with sleet, dark and heavy, wrapped tight around the body of his baby sister. She didn't move. Her face was buried deep against his shoulder, and he wouldn't let himself look, because if she wasn't warm anymore, he kept running. That's when he saw it. Not a cabin, not smoke, not even a lean-to, just a shape, tall, round, rusted, a broken water tower, slumped against a dead tree, the tank tipped like a rotted tooth in the snow. It should have meant nothing to him, just junk, but the wind shifted, and he smelled it. Smoke, real smoke. The boy stumbled forward, ice crackling underfoot, calling hoarsely into the storm. And from the iron hatch cut low into the side of that rusted tank, a woman stepped out with a lantern, belly heavy with child. She wasn't supposed to be alive either. She'd come here to die. That's what Ruth Cutter had told herself when she hitched the last mile of that frozen road from Ashton Fork, her husband buried beneath a rock slide, and her back seizing every time the wind changed. No sane woman built a home in an old rusted-out water tower, especially not a pregnant one. But Ruth had run out of sanity weeks ago. She found it half buried in a dry creek bed, like some beast had spit it there. The tank had been upright once, long ago, part of a rail line that had gone bust. The wooden supports lay rotted in a heap. The tank itself had tipped, partway cracked, resting on its side like a hollow log. To most, it looked useless. To Ruth, it looked like a womb, a sealed cylinder of thick steel, with a narrow base and walls curved to hold pressure. No gaps, no drafts, no way for snow to pile up inside. Just a little rust, a little rot, and a little imagination. It would take more than a hammer and handsaw to make it livable, but Ruth had both. The first night she burned sage and pine needles, not for warmth. It gave barely any, but to smoke the rats out. There were 3. One she caught with a looped wire, one she clubbed with a rock. The last, the biggest, watched her from a beam high above like he was waiting for her to fail. She named him Reverend. By the 3rd day, Ruth's fingers bled every time she gripped the hatchet. Her nails peeled back. Her shoulders screamed, but the wood she salvaged from the rail supports was still good. She built a false floor inside the tank using those old beams, raised it 2 feet off the ground so snowmelt couldn't seep in. She packed the gaps with moss and rags, set stones along the base to trap warmth. She slept curled against the iron wall like a dog. The cold made her baby kick harder. That meant he was alive. That meant she had to finish. A week later, she tore the iron hatch open. It was meant for watermen. A hand-width door just above the tank's base, sealed shut with rust and prayer. Took her hours to saw a crosscut around it, and longer still to scrape the burrs clean. She widened it enough to crawl through with her belly. Then she hung a wagon tarp over the hole and jammed pine branches into the gaps. Still, the wind sang through, so she buried the tank in snow. She did it slow, 1 shovel at a time, 1 layer a day, like an animal digging its own den. The stove came from Ashton Fork, dragged 4 miles on a goat cart she stole from a blind preacher who'd left his barn unlocked. It was cracked down the side. She fixed it with horseshoe nails and ash paste, lined the inside with clay, bent a stovepipe out of a rusted stovewell lid, and rammed it up through the tank's top with rocks packed around it like mortar. It smoked like hell, but it worked. The first night she lit it, something cracked high above her, and for a breathless moment, she thought the tank would split. But it held. The warmth hit her like a scream, like a prayer answered. She curled under her husband's old coat, belly hot with life, and sobbed until the fire went out. She hung cloth between the stove and the sleeping space. Didn't matter that it was her old funeral dress. It trapped the warmth better than a barn door. Everything mattered now. She scrounged sawdust and pine tar from a logging camp nearby, mixed it with ash and mud to make mortar, spread it along the inside seams like frosting. The baby kicked. She talked to him like he could hear her. "This old tower held pressure once," she whispered. "It'll hold us now." But nothing ever holds forever. The night the boy came screaming through the sleet, Ruth had been patching the hatch again. The storm had torn the tarp loose. Wind howled through like wolves. She almost didn't hear him. She didn't believe her ears when she did, but she opened the door anyway. And there he was, a boy no older than 8, blue-lipped, wild-eyed, holding a bundle that didn't cry. "I followed the smoke," he choked, and then he collapsed into her arms. Inside, it was hot, too hot for a baby who'd been nearly frozen. Ruth unwrapped the bundle while the boy moaned on the floor. His boots leaked, his fingers were white. The infant inside was motionless. Ruth didn't panic. She'd been a midwife once, before the mines took her man and the mud took her name. She knew what stillness meant, but she also knew cold could fool the body. She ripped open her own coat, pressed the baby's skin to skin against her chest, and wrapped them both in wool. She didn't say a word. She just rocked. Hours passed. The boy slept fitfully, limbs twitching. When he woke, he begged, "Is she alive?" Ruth didn't lie. "I don't know." The wind roared outside. It shook the tower. But inside, it was still. The baby gave a wet, choked hiccup. Then she whimpered. Then she wailed. Ruth cried harder than the girl did. She didn't know where the boy came from, or why no one was with him, or how long he'd wandered, but she let him sleep near the stove. She heated broth with pine nettle and fed him in slow sips. She gave him her husband's coat. He said his name was Eli. He didn't say his sister's. She didn't ask. She gave the baby a name instead, Fern, because she was pale and soft and grew best in shadow. That night, Ruth sat with her hands over her stomach, watching Fern sleep. The stove hissed gently, steam rising up through the patched pipe. Outside, the snow thickened into silence. The old tower didn't groan anymore. Its seams were sealed. Its warmth didn't leak. It had become something else. Not just a shelter, not just a place. It had become a womb. Again, the snow didn't stop. By the 5th day after Eli arrived, the trail to Ashton Fork was buried in drifts higher than a wagon bed. No one could come even if they'd wanted to. No one could leave. Ruth didn't ask questions she didn't need the answers to. Not yet. She let Eli feed the fire. Let him break up the dead twigs she'd stacked in the corner. Let him stay quiet and keep his eyes on Fern like he'd done something wrong. He was waiting for her to send him away. She never did. Her own baby had gone quiet. Not a full stop, but less kicking, less life. She felt it night after night, lying stiff on the raised pallet beside the stove, every inch of her aching from cold and coil. It could be exhaustion, could be the way she'd rationed her food, could be fear. It didn't matter. She didn't dare say it out loud. If she gave fear a name, it might listen. Instead, she wrapped herself in layers and whispered stories. Not for Eli, not for Fern, for the child still growing inside her. She told it about where they were, not the broken, rusted tower buried in snow, but the new place, the real place they were making. "A round house holds the heat," she murmured through cracked lips. "No corners for the cold to hide in. That's how the Pawnee built their earth lodges, and the cave bears before them. We're just doing what nature taught." Eli would sometimes listen, pretending he wasn't. He never asked about his parents, not once. One night, Ruth opened her eyes to a soft flicker, flame, not from the stove, from the floor. Eli. He'd taken a candle stub and lit it beneath one of the wooden beams, where frost crept in through a narrow seam Ruth hadn't sealed right. He was kneeling, cupping his hands around the flame, watching the frost melt like it was magic. Her voice was firm, but low. "Don't waste wax." He jumped. I know what you were doing," she said, pulling the blanket off and rising to her knees. "But wax won't save us. Ash will." She showed him the bucket she'd been saving, the one full of fine grey ash from weeks of stove burn. She knelt and packed it tight against the leaking seam, mixing it with pine tar and snow. The cold air hissed as it hit. She thudded, her palm against it, and nodded. "Now try it," she said. He pressed his hand to the patch. It was warm. Ash, tar, snow, like a secret spell. That was how trust started between them. Not with talk, with work. Eli didn't stay still after that. By morning, he was helping without asking. He cleared icicles from the stovepipe, thumping the side with a broom handle to keep soot from choking the fire. He helped strip bark for kindling, dug a snow trench away from the hatch so it wouldn't freeze shut. And every time Fern cried, he was first to her side. Ruth let him, even when her arms ached to hold the baby herself, even when she wanted to feel the weight of one child while fearing for another still inside her. She understood. He wasn't just helping, he was holding guilt. On the 10th day, Ruth finally asked, "Where's your family?" He stared at the fire so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, "They followed the preacher, out west." "What preacher?" He said the frost was punishment. Said if we crossed the ridge and made it to the valley, God would give us warmth. She waited. "But the bridge was out," he whispered. "My father said it didn't matter. That faith was the crossing." His lip trembled. "We tried to walk the riverbed." Ruth didn't speak. She let the words settle like ash. "I don't remember when they stopped walking," he said. "Only that I didn't." The ridge was 15 miles north, Ruth knew. The riverbed had caved in 3 winters ago. Most of it was just cracked shale and black ice now. No sane wagon crossed it, but people weren't always sane when they were desperate. "How far did you come?" she asked. He shrugged. "Cold makes the miles lie." That was true. She touched his shoulder gently. "I'm glad you made it," she said. He didn't answer, but his shoulders didn't stiffen. That was enough. The next night, the stove failed. It happened all at once. A hiss, a pop, then a rush of smoke that filled the tank like a cloud of burning pitch. Ruth threw the hatch open, screaming for Eli to stay down. Snow blew in with a fury. She choked, blinking tears, as she pulled the stovepipe free, clogged with creosote. She'd known it was building, hadn't wanted to risk taking it down, but now it was choking them. She wrapped her hands in cloth, climbed atop the mound of packed snow, and slammed the pipe against a stump until the tar-black clots broke free. Her fingers froze. She could barely hold the pipe when she set it back, but the smoke cleared, the fire relit. The tower lived another day. That night, she dreamed of the old cabin in Arkansas, the one she and John had shared before the mine buried him. It had been crooked and soft with rot, drafty even in spring, with rats under the floor and wind through the cracks. But it had a cradle. She'd carved it. She dreamed she found it again, pulled from a black river, smooth, pale, empty. She woke with blood on her thighs. It wasn't much, not at first. A smear, a warning. She didn't tell Eli. She told the stove, the iron wall, the rusted bolt she clutched like a crucifix as she counted the minutes between cramps. They came slow, then faster. The baby wasn't due for weeks, but time didn't ask permission. By the time her knees buckled, Eli had already dragged the blanket closer to the stove. He didn't speak, just moved, quiet and afraid, like an animal in a thunderstorm. She barked at him between pains. Bring water, clean snow, boil it. He nodded, then hesitated. What else? Her teeth clenched. Knife, string, and light. He did it all. When she screamed, he covered Fern's ears. When she wept, he lit a second candle. When she passed out, he kept the fire burning. The boy was born before dawn, small, silent, but alive. She named him Jonah, not because she liked the name, but because he'd been swallowed by darkness and spit back out, just like the old tale. Eli cradled him like he was glass. Ruth let herself cry then, let herself shake, and when the tower stopped spinning, she kissed both children and told them, no one leaves. That vow held. The blizzard burned itself out. The roof didn't collapse. The seams didn't split. Jonah suckled weakly. Fern slept often. Eli stayed at Ruth's side like a son who'd always been there. But food ran low. The salt pork was gone. The last potato sprouted. The only thing left was boiled pine bark and snow broth. Even ash couldn't fill a stomach. Ruth kept moving, kept working, kept watching the snow line for signs of crows, or worse, men, because something was coming. Something always did. One morning she stepped outside to empty the ash bucket and saw footprints, not hers, not Eli's, boot tracks, wide, deep, made within the hour. 2 sets. She didn't hesitate. She dropped the bucket and slammed the hatch shut, bolting it from the inside. Eli looked up, confused. She motioned him to silence. Then the knock came. "Hello, the tower!" A man's voice, flat, wet with cold. Ruth didn't answer. "We saw smoke," the voice said. "We're not looking for trouble." Another pause. "You got food? We'll trade." Silence. "Lady," the voice said again, rougher now. "We're half dead out here." Eli looked at Ruth, eyes wide. She moved slow, lifted her husband's old rifle from behind the stove, checked the breech, 1 round left. She whispered, "Go to the back. Take Fern and the baby. Quiet." He obeyed. She lifted the hatch flap and spoke. "One of you coughs wrong. I shoot." Outside stood 2 men, ragged, faces blistered red. One older, limping, one younger, mean-eyed. Neither carried a gun. That didn't make her feel safer. "We're just passing through," the younger one said. "Ain't seen shelter in miles." "This ain't shelter," Ruth said. "It's mine. You got fire. That's all we want." She squinted. "Fire don't come free." He smiled, but not kindly. Didn't say it had to. She didn't open the hatch, but she gave them 1 iron pot of hot water. Through the hatch slit, watched them fight over it like dogs. The older man thanked her. The younger spat. She didn't sleep that night, didn't let the fire go out, didn't breathe easy until 3 days later, when she hiked out and found the snow packed with blood. Coyotes, maybe, maybe not. Either way, she was glad she hadn't opened the door. When the thaw came, the tower dripped, not from leaks, from life. Jonah's cries echoed against the curved steel. Fern learned to stand. Eli carved little wheels from firewood scraps and built a cart for the baby. They were a family now, not the one Ruth had planned, but the one she'd saved. And the tower, it held heat, held life, held 3 children and 1 woman, with nothing left to give but herself. Ruth patched the roof with hide and tar, reinforced the stove with a second clay lining, dug a root cellar into the frozen earth beneath the floor, just wide enough for a sack of potatoes. She taught Eli how to seal a leak with nothing but ash and faith. And on the first night of spring, she took Jonah in her arms, stepped out into the moonlight, and whispered to the sky, "We made it." The spring melt didn't bring joy. It brought rot. Water crept under the tank's iron shell like a curse. Drips soaked the bedding. The pine bough insulation, once dry and fragrant, began to blacken. The floor swelled. The seams hissed steam at dawn. And the children, all 3 of them, coughed, not deep, not bloody, but wet. Ruth could feel the sickness hunting. She'd seen enough of death to know when it waited just beyond the next snowfall, and though the snow had melted, it never melted for long. It was late April when the water started pooling beneath the floor. Ruth pried up one board to check and nearly vomited. Black mold, spreading in ribbons along the underside of the old rail beams, festered by weeks of trapped snowmelt. The heat of the stove had helped, but it also cooked the damp into vapor. That vapor had no place to go. The tower had become a womb, but wombs left sealed too long could turn to tombs. She worked fast. The children sat outside, bundled in cloaks, as Ruth stripped the entire floor. She threw every mold-warped board into a pit and lit it on fire. She didn't wait for it to burn down. She scavenged dry planks from an abandoned loading dock a mile off, tied them to a sled, and dragged them back one at a time. Eli offered to help. She refused. He didn't need to see what she saw. The fire pit smoked for days. The wind shifted once and brought the scent of rot back inside. Jonah gagged. Fern whimpered. Ruth smeared wild onion beneath their noses and promised the wind would change again. That night she coughed blood into her hand. She didn't tell anyone. A spring dried the upper pines, and birds returned. To scratch the thawing earth, Ruth ventured further each day. She knew the land now, knew where water ran shallow, where the reeds bent low, where the cold clung to the hollows even after the sun had risen. She found the shell of a cabin buried in brush, 3 walls and a chimney. Inside, 1 metal washtub, a cracked butter churn, and a dead man who'd hung himself months before. She said a prayer, took his boots, left his rope. The washtub became the new hearth. She buried it halfway in the dirt floor, filled the edges with stone, and burned dry pine cones until the basin was black with soot. The tower needed a new stove. The old one had cracked again, this time beyond saving. She refused to burn the last of the fence posts to keep it going. Too dry, too thin. They smoked like wet straw and poisoned the air, so she built her own. Clay, dung, stone, and stubbornness. It looked like a beehive and roared like a freight engine. Jonah giggled every time it lit. Eli named it Hogjaw. Ruth didn't argue. That summer, Eli learned to snare rabbits. Not many, but enough. He laid loops along the riverbanks, checked them at dawn. Once he found a badger instead. It hissed and lunged. He came back bleeding and wild-eyed, knuckles bruised. Ruth didn't scold. She showed him how to pack sage into the cuts, how to sit still so the blood would slow. "You didn't run," she said. "That counts." He beamed. She dug a drainage channel next, 2 feet deep, lined with flat shale. It circled the tower like a moat. When the rains came, it kept the floor dry. And it did rain, harder than she remembered. The skies in the highlands didn't bother with drizzle. When they opened, they cracked, thunder like split mountains. Water slammed the iron like fists, but the tower never leaked. The seals she'd patched in winter held firm, all except one, a rivet near the top, where the roof curve thinned to a weak point. It didn't leak water, it leaked sound, and it was through that tiny crack of air that Ruth first heard them coming. Voices, 2 men, laughing, boots on stone. She froze, ladle in hand, half bent over the cookpot. Eli sat on the far side of the floor, carving notches into a stick. Fern lay curled in a sling. Jonah fussed on the pallet. Ruth held up one finger. Silence. She pressed her ear to the wall. Not close, just close enough to hear. "Swear I seen smoke, right from the top. No one's out here but owls and widows. She's still here." "You saw her?" A grunt. Then, "Not this year, but she's here. My cousin saw her last spring, said she had a rifle and a look like a snake bit her baby." The second voice chuckled. "That mean, huh? Mean enough to keep 6 scavers off her doorstep?" "Yeah? How?" "Shot 2, starved the rest. Didn't lift a hand. Cold bitch. She's got food." Another pause. "I want it." Ruth didn't wait for the knock. She grabbed the rifle. Only 1 round, same as last winter, but the barrel still worked. She loaded it, opened the hatch, and stepped out into the rain. There they were, 2 of them, not the same men from before, but not strangers either. One tall, greasy-hatted, with a beard like dirty straw. The other shorter, stockier, eyes like wet rocks. They didn't flinch when she leveled the gun. "Don't," she said. The shorter one grinned. "Mrs., we don't want—" "Don't," she said again. The tall one stepped forward. "Got kids in there, don't you?" Ruth didn't blink. He smiled. "Means you got food." The rifle didn't shake, but her hands did. The men saw it, and they waited. She didn't pull the trigger, not that day, because Jonah cried behind her. And that sound, thin, soft, hungry, was louder than any threat. She stepped back, pulled the hatch closed, and bolted it, and waited. They didn't break in, not that night, but they stayed nearby, camped half a mile off, left signs, carvings on trees, stones stacked in strange piles. It wasn't superstition, it was pressure. They were testing her. She lit 3 fires that night, one in the stove, one outside, one in her gut. The next morning she found a rabbit hung by its back feet on a hook driven into a pine, freshly killed, gutted, still warm, a gift. She left it there. Next day, it was gone, replaced by a bundle of wild herbs and a bent silver spoon. The message was clear. You have what we want. Let us in, and we'll trade. She didn't answer, didn't send gifts, didn't fire warning shots. She did something worse. She let the tower go cold. For 2 full nights, she put out the fire, let no smoke rise, let the hatch freeze. And when Jonah cried from the cold, she held him tight and whispered, only for a little. On the 3rd day, the men left. Hunger made beasts of people, but silence scared them more. When summer turned to fall, Ruth knew the freeze would return harder than the last. It always did. She dug a chimney trench off the back of the tower and buried the new stove's pipe beneath packed clay. Let it vent 20 feet downslope. No more smoke signals. She made a dummy fire, a pile of char and pine cones under an old pot to light if someone watched from a distance. She built a second hatch, hidden beneath the tower, leading to the root cellar, just in case. And she taught Eli how to lock the inside bolts so no man could break them. They harvested what little they could: chokecherries, fireweed, sorrel, and cattail roots. Eli caught 3 muskrats in a single week. Fern learned to walk. Jonah cut his first tooth. The tower, once a place to survive, had become a place to stay, a place to grow, a place to return to. And for Ruth, that was the problem, because what grows is what men want, and no shelter stays secret forever. Late that fall, a letter came, folded in waxed paper, dropped through the stove vent. No signature, just words scratched in charcoal. They're coming, 10 men, not traders, 1 week, run if you can. Ruth read it twice, then burned it. She didn't tell Eli, not yet. She told him to double the traps, told him to help her dig new fire pits, told him to gather every stone he could carry. He obeyed, but his eyes asked questions. When she didn't answer, he didn't press. 6 days later, she sent the children away, not far, just across the ridge, to a dugout she'd built years ago as a backup shelter, covered in sod, lined with bark, hidden, safe. Eli didn't want to go. I can fight, he said. You can live, she replied. He carried Jonah in one sling and Fern in the other. She kissed their foreheads. I'll come soon, she lied. The men came at dawn. Not 10, closer to 7, but that was enough. They didn't knock, they didn't speak. They surrounded the tower and waited. Ruth watched from the peephole she'd drilled above the hatch. They were armed, knives, clubs. One had a rifle. She took a breath, lit the hidden wick she'd run beneath the stones, the one that trailed from the fire pit to the chimney trench. Smoke rose, but not from the tower, from the ground behind it, a bluff. The men saw it and circled wide. She opened the hatch, stepped out, and raised the rifle. What happened next would be told differently depending who survived. Some would say she killed 2 men. Some would say she never fired. Some would say the fire drove them off. Others would say the earth itself shook. But the truth was simpler. She stood her ground. She didn't run. And when they saw the woman with smoke in her hair and steel in her arms, they hesitated, just long enough for the bear. It came from the east, where the snows lingered later. A black bear, skinny, scarred, half-starved from a long summer of drought. It wasn't trained, wasn't summoned, but nature has its own rhythm, and the scent of blood and meat and fire had drawn it in. It didn't attack Ruth, it attacked the men, and by the time the screams faded, only Ruth stood upright. She didn't shoot the bear, she let it feed. Then she walked back inside and closed the hatch. The bear didn't linger, it fed, it wandered, it vanished. By the next morning, the snow had begun to fall again, early, heavy, clinging, the kind of snow that signaled more than just weather. It was a message, a line drawn. Winter had returned, and Ruth Cutter had lived to see it. She stood outside the water tower as the sky turned grey, boot soles sunk deep in half-frozen mud, rifle still slung over one shoulder, the barrel slick with dried dew. The bodies were gone. The blood had vanished beneath the white, but she still felt them, not the men themselves, but the silence that came after. She waited 2 more hours before stepping back inside. Then she bolted the hatch and sat down beside the hearth with her hands over her face, and she didn't move for nearly half the day. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the fire. Instead, watched as it cracked along the lip of the clay stove, sending shadows up the curved steel wall. Her breath showed faintly, ghost-like in the air. The tower held warmth better now. The vents worked. The new seals had lasted. The floor, rebuilt and raised again, sat on packed clay and buried rock. She'd even woven a reed mat from cattail stalks that insulated their sleeping area better than a wool rug. But the silence inside wasn't warmth, it was absence. The children were still gone. And the longer she waited, the more the snow threatened to seal the ridge completely. She couldn't leave them out there much longer. She had to move. By mid-morning, Ruth had packed everything she needed, just enough to carry. Flint, tallow, 3 strips of dried meat, a blanket, a short-handled axe, and a wrapped bundle of boiled cornmeal. She took no rifle. She needed speed more than she needed defense now. Before the snows turned real, she had to get her children. She stepped out into wind. The dugout lay across a low rise, behind a stand of wind-bent juniper and thick brush. She'd built it years ago during one of the first hard springs she'd survived out here. An old pit used by trappers, widened and reinforced, then forgotten. It was meant to be a storm shelter, not a home, but it held. She could smell the smoke from 100 yards off, faint, woodsy, mingled with the smell of rabbit and wet wool. Eli had kept the fire low and the chimney clear. Smart boy. She found them sleeping. Fern curled under a blanket made from old horsehide, mouth open slightly. Jonah in the crook of Eli's arm, flushed but breathing. Eli woke first. He didn't speak, just looked at her with wide eyes, then threw his arms around her. Ruth didn't cry. She just held them all, quietly, for as long as the cold would let her. Back at the tower, everything felt smaller, not cramped, but tight, familiar. The children's voices filled the curved walls again. Jonah babbled now, louder and more often. Fern mimicked Ruth, copying how she folded cloth or stirred stew. Eli no longer needed instruction to chop wood or tie traps. They were a unit now, not a family born of blood, but of survival. They had a rhythm, and the tower had changed with them. What had once been bare steel and snow-packed walls was now patched with stitched cloth, hanging herbs and strips of sun-bleached hide. The hearth burned clean. The bedding was dry. The root cellar held enough to last the worst month. Even the creak of the old beams sounded different now, less like groaning, more like breathing. Spring returned like a breath held too long, not with fanfare, no melting trumpet, no instant thaw, just a slow, deliberate retreat of white from the edges of things. Snow vanished first from the branches, then from the tower's base, and finally from the trail down to the riverbed. Ruth didn't trust it at first. She'd seen springs turn cruel before, springs that lured desperate folks out of shelter with sunshine and promise, only to blindside them with a sudden freeze. So she waited until the trickle under the root cellar turned to a stream, waited until sap ran again in the birch bark, waited until Fern could sleep without a cough and Jonah stopped tugging at his ears and crying at night. Only then did she believe. Only then did she unlock the hatch in the morning and let them all step outside together. They stood in silence for a while. The snow still dotted the hills, but it was patchy now, thin and tired, clinging only in shade. Eli climbed onto the rocks to look down the valley and let out a low whistle. There were deer tracks again, birdsong, and a shape far in the distance. Human, perhaps, but walking away, not toward. Ruth watched the clouds. They moved slow, no anger in them. Jonah fussed against her chest in his sling. Fern clung to her leg, blinking at the bright. "You remember this place?" Ruth asked softly. Fern didn't answer. She just leaned harder into her, but Eli did. "It looks smaller now?" Ruth smiled. "It always does, after you survive something." They could have left then, could have taken what little they had, lashed it to sleds, and followed the river trail down toward Ashton Fork, or even further west. The passes would open soon. Other folks would return, some for trapping, some for wood, some out of plain hunger. There'd be news again, trade, talk, safety maybe. But Ruth didn't pack, not yet. She knelt beside the base of the tower and ran her palm over the steel, still solid, still warm, where the sun had touched it, still theirs. She and Eli spent the next 2 weeks reinforcing the cellar. The thaw had loosened the earth, caused one wall to bow inward slightly, so they dug it deeper, braced it with planks salvaged from the old fire pit, made it proper, added shelving, even built a rough rack for drying herbs. Fern helped by gathering pine cones and pretending they were babies that needed little nests. Jonah teethed on a carved bit of hickory and watched the world with those new, serious eyes babies get when they're about to do something dangerous. And Ruth cooked. Nothing fancy, just meat, root, and smoke. But it was warm, and it was enough. They ate together each night around the fire, sitting on old hides, telling stories Eli half invented, and Ruth let stand without correction. Sometimes she'd catch herself laughing, really laughing, and that scared her more than the cold ever had, because it meant she was starting to hope again. And hope, out here, could kill faster than frost. She wrote a letter one morning, didn't send it, had no way to, but she wrote it, to no one really, maybe to herself, maybe to the woman she used to be, maybe to the next poor soul who might find the tower and wonder how anyone could ever have lived inside such a thing. She wrote, "This isn't a shelter, not anymore. It's a beginning. It held me when I was alone. It held us when we were hunted. It held against storms, men, hunger, fever, and fire. But most importantly, it held because I didn't build it as a fortress. I built it like a womb. And the thing about wombs is, they give birth to something stronger. If you find this and you're running, don't just hide. Build. Make the place your own. And when you're strong again, open the door." She folded the paper and tucked it behind a loose seam in the roof, just above the pallet where Jonah slept, just in case. Summer arrived in a rush. With it came birds so bold they stole meat from the traps before Eli could check them. Deer grazed right down by the water. Wild strawberries grew in tight patches near the rocks. Ruth taught Fern to crush them for dye. Painted a red handprint over the tower's hatch. A warning, perhaps, or a promise. One day in early July, a rider came. Not a raider, not a preacher, just a man in a wide-brimmed hat, grey in his beard, rifle strapped across his back, leading a pack mule. He stopped 100 yards out and raised both hands. Didn't speak, just waited. Ruth saw him from the ridge. Eli was with her, skin burned on one side from a sun slip, but grinning. "Friend?" he asked. "Not yet," Ruth said. But she didn't raise the rifle. She walked down instead. His name was Hale. He'd come from Beartooth Junction, 20 miles west. Said he'd been traveling alone since April, looking for sign of survivors, trying to map the damage the storms had done. Said folks were starting to come back now. Families, traders, homesteaders. "Not many," he admitted, "but enough to start talking about rebuilding." Ruth asked what that meant. He looked around, at the tower, the patched chimney, the raised cellar, and the smoke holes. Then he looked at her. "Whatever you want it to mean." She offered him broth and a place to rest. He slept beside the fire like someone who hadn't been warm in months. When he left 2 days later, he carried news of them, of the woman and 3 children who'd turned a dead water tower into a home. She didn't tell him their names. Didn't need to. What mattered wasn't who they were. What mattered was what they'd built. By fall, others had followed. A woman with 2 sons, both thin as fence posts. An old trapper with one good eye and a sack full of seeds. A young couple who'd lost their claim to a flash flood, holding nothing but a broken fiddle and each other. They came like driftwood, worn, battered, but floating. Ruth didn't turn them away. She taught them how to seal iron with ash and clay, how to trap heat beneath stone, how to listen to the wind. Eli took the younger ones out for snaring lessons. Fern taught them to paint with berries. Jonah walked now, everywhere, laughing as he tripped through the grass and mud, unafraid. That winter, there were 5 stoves burning within a mile of the old tower. Ruth stood outside at dusk and watched the smoke rise. It curled upward in long, smooth lines, a sign, not of survival, but of return. She never gave the place a name, never built a fence, never declared it hers. But folks began calling it Ruth's Tower, not for the steel, not for the shape, but for what it stood for what it had done, for how it had held even when the world cracked. And every year on the first morning the frost touched the roots again, Ruth would walk out and press her palm to the rusted side of that old tank. Still cold, still strong, still hers, but never just hers. Because the thing about a shelter, the real kind, is that once it saves you, you don't get to keep it all to yourself.